What's up, guys? Derek, moreplates.moredates.com. Today I'm going to be reacting to purportedly Paul Dillet's cycle from the 90s. Not necessarily his cycle, just his use in general. I've done a couple of these already, and I'm hoping to do kind of like a series of several top caliber Olympia bodybuilders. And, you know, these are interviews conducted with Tom Platz that were intended to remain anonymous, but you know, the internet's the internet, and people can figure out pretty easily with deciphering the 90s technology of looking at these blurred faces and listening to the noise distortion, like probably who it is. And you know, so like just under the, you know, basis of it might be Paul Dillet, could be any other person, like just keep that in mind. You know, I'm not to say just because the title says something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's 100% factual. This is just an educated guess and doesn't necessarily mean that's who is in this video. So just a heads up on that. And if for some reason I forget to clarify that on any of the other future ones, the exact same thing I just said applies for all of those as well, because I'm going to do a few more videos like this. So without further ado, let's get into it.
At what point in your career did you realize you needed or felt compelled to utilize steroids?
I think as you know how any professional sport, you know, what it is that compel you to do that is the competitiveness inside of you, you know, wanting to win. Mm-hmm. And you know, we all start at an early age, so you're young and kind of hothead. Mm-hmm. You know, the only thing you care about is number one. Mm-hmm. So if someone gives you anything or tell you about anything that's going to give you that edge, you'll do it. So, you know, for myself, that was what it is, just, you know, just wanting to win.
At what age did you start taking
I was 23.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Say 23, that's not, I don't think that's... Like to him, I guess back then 23 seemed young. You have kids who are like 16 now that are saucing though, so that's kind of crazy how they consider that really young back then. Now that would almost be conservative nowadays.
I'd like to, I know these are sensitive issues and you're not used to talking about it, but again, your identity is protected, okay? No one's going to know who you are except me, and of course it will never come from me. Okay, I assure you of that. What specific steroids do you find effective for your training?
Well, I mean, I guess in the off season,
okay,
you know, your basic would be. I always think it's best to stay with the basics. Stick with something that some, you know, American, something that, you know, you can get a prescription from, you know, and go to a pharmacy and get some which would be like any kind of testosterone.
You have the ability to get prescriptions and legally and.
Yeah, you can get prescription. Okay. You know, I think there's still some, you know, there's still doctors out there who believe.
See, that's interesting because a lot of guys think people in the 90s didn't really... Well, I guess maybe people think people in the 90s did use tests and it started to become more popular, but it's like, you know, the classic more like 70s, 80s era, everyone thought test was something that just wasn't even used, and a lot of people think in the 90s no one really touched test, but evidently there was doctors prescribing it to bodybuilders still.
Believe that, you know, regardless of what anyone says, you know, athletes are going to do what they're going to do to win. And they feel that maybe it's better for them to write someone a prescription so they know that what they're getting is real, instead of going on the black market and get something that isn't what it's supposed to be. And, you know, then just get injected into his body and, you know, it does more harm than anything else.
Yeah, I've had people I know injected Armorol into their system and all kinds of things.
You know, so I mean, testosterone is one of your basics, one of the basic things.
What form of testosterone do you find most effective in terms of your regime?
For the off season, I think Cypionate is best. Mixed with Deca, which is you know, alcoholic, but also.
So Cypionate is a long ester testosterone, if you aren't aware, and Deca, long ester attached to nandrolone and nandrolone decanoate. This is like the official name, but I'm sure more commonly known as Deca. Pretty standard combination. like even nowadays.
It have some androgenic properties in it also. Combined with maybe one oral, maybe Anadrol, something like that. Anadrol 50. You know, maybe 1 to 2 tablets a day, depending on the body weight of the person. You know, so sometimes some people might think that if I want one a day, I get this much. Then if I do 3 or 4, I'll get that much, which is actually, for me, that's actually the reverse. I think it's best to take a small amount of 3, 4 different things than to try to cram two things into your body and overload your system.
I agree with that too. Obviously, not in the context of, you know, performance enhancing use, of course. I'm just saying that, you know, back when, like, if I was still doing this, that would be my preferred approach as well, rather than overloading my system with something that fulfills one mechanism of action using smaller amounts of several pathways of growth with less overall side effects and more compounding growth factors. So Anadrol at 50 to 100 milligrams per day, that seems pretty common among the 90s guys, and not much. I'm surprised I haven't heard any D-ball use yet, because I think maybe that was more 70s, but I thought that would be chosen a bit more among these guys, because it was, you know, you would think you'd take after what the guys before you did and sort of adopt their principles, but it doesn't necessarily seem like that's the case. Seems like Anadrol is the go-to oral of choice. I suppose probably because it had more clinical application at the time, being prescribed for an array of people, including children. So it's probably a lot more readily accessible, I would think. I don't know for sure, though.
Well, along the lines of you're speaking of dosages, I mean, relative to the drugs you just mentioned in the off season, since we're staying in the off season, what would those be like?
I think, you know, for a guy, let's say 240 pounds, 400 milligrams to 500 milligrams of cypionate a week is sufficient. I mean, I've heard stories of guys doing a whole bottle in 1 week. I mean, which is, that's nuts. That's
400 to 500 mgs a week of tests. That sounds a lot lower than people would assume somebody this size would be taking, that's for sure. But I've kind of, over the years, come to see that I don't think overloading a pathway that just aromatizes into estrogen and 5-alpha reduces into DHT, which is a terrible hormone for muscle building, I don't think that necessarily overloading that pathway is a smart way to go. So I think 400 to 500 makes complete sense for when in conjunction with other things at, you know, efficacious dosages for the intentions of this, you know, protocol.
It's crazy. You know, all you're going to do is, those are the guys you see in the gym who, they're red, you know, they have that bloated look, they have really bad skin. That's a sign of, you know, you're over-toxing your body, and your body's not utilizing it. So it's, you know, your body's trying to secrete it, you know, through your pores, you know, so that dosage would be more than sufficient for anyone.
So if you combine that with...
You went about another 400 milligrams of one to two Anadrols a day.
Per week, 400 milligrams of deca a week.
Yeah, and one Anadrol a day.
So 400 deca per week with 400 to 500 tests with 50 to 100 milligrams of Anadrol per day. So it's funny because that's kind of like something that a lot of guys would do on like their first or second cycle nowadays. And maybe even more than that. It's a lot of people wouldn't believe that that's a dosage that would be sufficient for somebody of this size. You know, could he be lying? I don't know. Of course, obviously. But I mean, I don't see why he would. And frankly, I think if you have just freak genetics and you have like myostatin deficiencies and polymorphisms and alleles that would indicate that you just have a superior ability to put on muscle than everyone else, you know, it doesn't really come down to stupid high dosages. I just think it comes down to saturating androgen receptors and then eating enough food and training. And that's like, you know, this guy's using 400 to 500 tests. That's, I don't think you really get a whole lot above and beyond that when you start pushing it to like above 500. You're just forcing yourself to need AIs, which is going to hinder IGF. It's going to smash your lipids even worse. It's going to prevent the literal mechanism of growth in which you were intending to seek by using something that aromatizes into estrogen in the first place. And then adding DECA in conjunction with 50 to 100 anadrol, that's like super modest in today's standards.
That's more than enough.
Now, how long might you do that during the off season?
I think you would do that maybe if you don't have to do anything throughout the whole year. If you have a show, you might want to start 16 weeks out. And you would do that for the first, from 16 weeks up to 10 weeks. Once you get to the 10-week period, then you'd want to switch from DECA and from cypionate. What you want to switch to is maybe propionate, which is quicker acting, stays in the system a lot shorter time, goes in a lot quicker, and it doesn't retain all that water. So that would be good. And you get.
I don't necessarily buy into that either. I used to think the same thing, that maybe enanthate and cypionate and decanoate and long esters hold more water, but I think it's more so, I don't know. Maybe they'd probably do to some extent, but I've seen a lot of guys come into shows on long esters and just get lean enough and they're dry. Like, it doesn't matter. It's just a matter of losing enough fat most of the time. And the whole like switch to short ester thing, I'm not really sure it, in practical application, it really makes a huge difference. I think it's just like if you're too fat or not kind of thing. And switching to the short esters, I'm not sure if it's like, there's a point when the literal hormone is saturated in your system. And there's a lot of evidence, if you go look at the clinical data, that shows increased nitrogen retention with the long esters. So whether that comes down to some sort of intramuscular water or what that comes down to, I'm not really sure, but you know, arguments can be made both ways. I don't think it really makes a big difference either way, to be honest, but it's interesting to see where that kind of like theory came from, because guys in the 90s were even doing this, and still to this day guys are, you know, doing that.
Rid of the DECA, I mixed that with Pinabol and Depot, which is a pure anabolic, and at the same time has.
Okay, so at 10 weeks out, he's swapping to short esters from test sip to test prop, and he's adding in Primo, and he's saying it's pure anabolic, which is, you know, not actually true. In reality, it does have a level of androgenicity, and I've actually covered that in a recent video where I compared 1,200 milligrams of Primo to 300 milligrams of test prop in a clinical study. Granted, it does have a favorable ratio of anabolic to androgenic activity, but it's by no means purely anabolic where you have no androgenicity whatsoever. It's still going to induce viralizing side effects in women. It's still going to do this, cause androgenic sides in men. It's a anabolic androgenic steroid that does, it's not like a SARM or like, and even SARMs aren't like 100% selective. Nothing's come that far yet. So it's not purely anabolic, just as a reference there.
No androgenic effect.
And the dosage on the Primo?
The dosage on the Primo. Primo is very mild. Perhaps why the safer steroid there is. So you could go 500 to 600 milligrams of that per week. You know, you could get anadrol in, but what you'd want to do is cycle it. So if you started 16 weeks out, then you'd go 1 month straight, and then stop for a month, and then get on again. So you give your system a chance to get a break, and also your body don't become a creature of habit, so it doesn't get adapted to it.
Okay, so a lot of funny things to cover in that I thought too. Granted, I'm just some dude not critiquing, like reviewing information from a super genetic phenom from the 90s who didn't have access to the internet like I do, where I can actually look at clinical studies for this and research my face off. So anyways, the first thing he said, which should be noted, 500 to 600 Primo per week, which I feel like a lot of people would consider maybe moderate, but even perhaps low based on what a lot of guys are doing. Most guys won't run Primo less than like 700 because they think it's so weak. So anyways, and then he's talking about how, what do you say? He said you should cycle off the anadrol every 4 weeks and then go back on 4 weeks to give your body a break. And because your body's going to get used to it. Well, first of all, giving your system a break, I don't know if he's referring to just like your liver in general. Like, I could understand the kind of It's funny because this arbitrary 4-on 4-off rotation has kind of just been like passed through the grapevine, but it's like, is this based on some sort of like consistent blood work that is shown at like the 4-week mark? Your liver enzymes like are cranked through the roof, and then you need 4 weeks to come back out and like clean them up. I don't really know. I doubt it, but you know, in clinical data, it's not like they're cycling patients on and off of Anadrol every 4 weeks. So granted, that's definitely what he's referring to, is the toxicity that Anadrol can induce in the body. Secondly, he's mentioning your body is getting used to it. That's not the case whatsoever. Androgen receptors actually upregulate in the presence of exogenous androgens. They don't downregulate, contrary to popular belief. The thing that does happen is when your androgen index goes up, myostatin elevates in parallel to prevent you from gaining too much muscle. So, you know, unless you're myostatin deficient, then that's a bit different. But like 99.999% of people have a functioning myostatin gene or genes without, you know, weird genetic polymorphisms on them. So myostatin increases, which would then inherently inhibit your progress just due to the presence of the hormone, not because your body gets used to it necessarily. It's kind of hard to explain, but basically, like when you're in a calorie deficit too, the point is to retain tissue. It's not to necessarily grow. So I'm not sure what is accomplished via going on and off in like the theory of your body gets used to it and you to like cycle off. I guess like it sort of gets used to it, but it's more so your inherent defense mechanism from preventing you from getting to 400 pounds of lean muscle, because you know, your body's not supposed to get that muscular. So there's feedback loops in place to regulate that. So anyway, I'm kind of rambling. Let's keep going.
And about 10 to 12 weeks out, you could start some growth hormone with that. You know, again, that goes by body weight.
Okay.
You know, and
so what you've used in the past in terms of growth hormone might be.
For myself, I've gone up to as high as and I use a day. You know, so again, you know.
By the way, some of these this is like a VHS tape, and those like glitches on the audio where it like cuts off his voice. That's not me, that's them. So like right there where you couldn't really tell what his dose was, that was not my doing, unfortunately.
Right.
Yeah, this you would do maybe about 12 weeks out.
Okay, but so the off season you're calling the first month.
The first month, because you know there's no reason. I mean, if you do 2 shows a year, then you should. And I use a day. You know. So again.
Like I don't know if he said 8. Like I can't even tell.
It all goes by the body weight.
Right.
You know, each individual is different. So again, more is not necessarily better. I just felt that a good mixture has always been growth hormone mixed with prenatal depot, some kind of just. I've gone up to as high as and I use a day. You know.
10? I don't know. I don't know what he's saying. So.
Body weight.
Right.
You know, each individual is different. So again, more is not necessarily better. I just felt that a good mixture has always been growth hormone.
That's true too. I should touch on is more is not better, especially in a contest prep phase. So if you're trying to use growth hormone for hyperplasia and boosting your IGF in the off season to grow, that's one thing. Where smashing or blasting your levels to like acromegaly levels perhaps makes more sense, but in the context of lipolysis, your lipolysis benefits are pretty much maxed out at like a few IUs per day depending on your body weight, and that's with a feedback loop in place where those dosages need to be split up. So there's definitely a huge diminishing returns effect in a contest prep with GH, just as a reference point there.
Mixed with prenatal depot, some kind of testosterone, and I have it mixed together is a good combination for a pre-contest.
And if you want to see the data on that, by the way, I don't want to get into like a 20-minute rant about the clinical data that supports that statement regarding limited lipolysis effect via GH dosages. Go look at my reacting to Eric Konevsky's Cycle or something. I think that was the title of it. And it was definitely about Eric Konevsky. I just don't remember exactly what the title was, but his name's in the title, so it should be easy to find. And somewhere in the middle there, I detail exactly where the rate of diminishing returns is in regards to lipolysis with exogenous GH usage.
So this is like, again, 4 months out, right?
Yeah, this you would do maybe about 12 weeks out.
Okay, but so the off season you're calling the first month.
The first month, because there's no reason. I mean, if you do 2 shows a year, then realistically you only need 12 weeks. So you go on for 12 weeks. It takes you about 12 weeks to get yourself in shape. Once that 12-week time period is up, your show is here. It's over. It's done. You detoxify yourself. You drink a lot of fluid. You take salt palmetto for your state. Milk thistle for the liver. Dandelion, all these things. Cranberry pills for the kidneys. And of course, go on always get a checkup before and after every show. Which is a safe route to go.
As one of the top guys in the world, you work with a doctor.
Yeah. I think you definitely want to have someone in your corner who,
So even back then, they're stressing the importance of cleaning out your body, coming off totally. I'm assuming he's talking about coming off totally and not cruising. Talking about getting blood work done, well, I guess that's what a checkup is. I'm assuming. I don't think saw palmetto does much, to be honest, and milk thistle, what's going to determine if your liver's functioning correctly is your diet, your genetics, and not being on hella drugs. But anyway, obviously they have a less is more mentality and safety first. Well, obviously not safety first if they're walking around at 300 pounds and using super physiological levels of androgens, but it's a lot more conservative than the modern day.
It's like anything else. If you have cancer, you have to have a doctor that prescribes and tell you what to take, what's the dosage, or any kind of health problem. So if you're going to do something like this, you need someone also who is going to prescribe and someone who's going to tell you this is too much, this is too little, and point you in the right direction instead of shooting in the dark and going and walking in the dark. It's like going into a room where there's no lights. I mean, you may make it to the other end, but then again, you may not. You may bump into the coffee table, So turn on the lights, see where you're going. The best way to turn the lights on is, go and see someone who, is more knowledgeable and not some guru, for say, but an actual doctor.
During the year, is there a particular amount or number of months or weeks that you do not take steroids?
Well, for myself, as one of the top bodybuilders, I only need to compete maybe once a year. So I think, staying off for 7 months, is beautiful. Off for 8 months is great, because no one wants to, sometimes I think people are under the impression that, you enjoy doing this. At this level of the game, it's about making, a buck. It's about, taking care of your family, paying the bills, and people can't point a finger at you. But in every professional sport, you do what you got to do. When it comes down to your, where it's your family or this, you're going to choose your family. And if this is your means of making a living, some guys don't realize that there's a life outside of bodybuilding. Now, if you have a family, then you realize that. If you have a family, then you realize that you know all the consequences that can come from it. So therefore, you want to stay off for as long as you possibly can. The longer you stay on, the more chance you have of doing harm to yourself. So for me, I enjoy that fact that I can stay off for 7, 8 months each time.
So he's claiming he comes off, he's only on gear for 4 to 5 months a year, which I don't really know about that for somebody his size, but who am I to say? I don't know.
In regards to staying off that long, are there exhibitions that that arise during the year how do you handle that circumstance?
Well, of course, you do your appearances all year long, hopefully. But I can't let that dictate my health. Because you can have all the money in the world, but if you don't have your health, it doesn't mean anything. So, I try my best to stay in decent condition. Just by doing at least still 3-4 days a week, half an hour of cardio. Still eat what I want, but watch what I eat, and still train pretty hard. There's no reason, because you're not taking something, mean that you can't go in the gym and put 100% in. Grant you, you don't have the same recovery time.
Without the steroids,
right,
you don't have the same recovery.
Right. It does give you better recovery time. It does help you. You can get less rest and still go back in the gym and put in 100%. It helps with your joints and stuff like that. So, in that sense, it does do some. There is some benefits to it. At the same time, you're not pushing it on anyone.
So there are definitely some health considerations you're thinking about.
Definitely. Again, like I said, if you don't have a family, sometimes it can make you reckless. Now, if you have a family, it just makes you think twice. Because nothing is worth that. Nothing is worth your life, and it's unfortunate that you have people who they do stay on all year round, and they're afraid of looking a certain way when they go and make a guest appearance. If I make a guest appearance, like I said, I try to look the best I can, but if it's not good enough for you, then there's nothing I can do about that. Because you're sitting in the audience and you may be appreciating what's on stage, but you're not really appreciating me as a person, myself as a person, and you have to realize and say, hey.
One thing I think that should be noted is, if this is Paul Dillet, he's noticeably downsized in recent years, and it's really commendable, because it's one thing, he's talking about health and the importance of coming off and importance of staying on top of your health and whatnot, and it's one thing for a bodybuilder to deal with the fact mentally that he's gonna have to take what he's doing take it 10 steps back and take his foot off the gas and probably never gain muscle again, because he can't run blast high dosages anymore. But it's a completely other thing for somebody like this, who's like 300 pounds lean, to have to accept mentally that they're gonna literally watch all of their hard work just melt in front of their eyes over the next few years once they stop blasting these insane dosages. Well, actually, his weren't even insane, assuming that's what he actually took. But pounding that much food, training as hard as he was, taking whatever he took, the mental fortitude that it would take for this guy to drop from where he was at in this video to where he's at now. Like, if you don't know what he looks like now, go look at him and you'll be shocked. You would not even know that it was this guy in this video, assuming that it's actually him, of course. I don't actually know. I'm just guessing. But, somebody like this who's walking around at 300 lean, like, those are the guys on the chopping block for being, like, a bodybuilding statistic, and, like, the next guy to have heart failure from, severe enlarged hearts, or, plaque buildup, or what have you, from, cardiovascular implications and whatnot. And it's always the mass monsters that are the most prone to heart disease, because your body just has to work that much harder to circulate oxygen and blood around. Like, your heart has to provide literal, like, support the functioning of 300 pounds of muscle almost. Like, that's an insane workload to put on a body, and that's why usually the guys drop in their 30s are, the really big dudes, or at least that's what you hear about the most, I guess. But I would assert that the more muscle on your frame, the more stress it is on your cardiovascular system. And for somebody like this to go, like, from this and then drop like 100+ pounds of muscle to become healthier, it's thinking about your family and thinking about, your friends and everyone close to you. Like, it's really commendable and something that should be said about that, because a lot of guys don't have the mental fortitude to allow their body to go through that downward spiral of losing everything they built over the years that their entire image is based off of. And, you know, when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, it's like, do you want to live a long, healthy life, or do you want to stay 300 pounds and live another 10 to 20 years maybe? And that's like, a lot of the time, that's what it seems to come down to in bodybuilding. So definitely something to take note of.
He's thinking about his health, so therefore he can't be in Olympic condition all year long. You know, basically you should just be, you know, it's just the fact that you get an opportunity to meet these guys in person, and them coming on stage, you know, they're not at their best, but at the same time, it's just you appreciate the fact that you can't see them all the time. So maybe once in your whole life, you may get to see them right there in front of you. So just take it for what it is. You know, just appreciate them for that moment. You know, you can't, as the athlete, you can't dwell on it when someone says, "Oh, he looks like shit," and, you know, you're like, "Hey, I look like shit, but I'm happy."
See, this is really good too, because he's, you know, there's a lot of people rag on guys who show up for guest posing when they're like obviously out of shape and not just like diced to the socks like they are when they go on stage normally for a show. It's like, it's unrealistic to expect a bodybuilder to look in shape year round, even if it is their job. You're pretty much saying you have to die in 10 to 20 years if you want to. And not always, obviously, but I mean, like, I remember it was like Andreas Munzer was like within like 2 weeks striking distance of being show ready, like year round or something insane like that. And he was like doing guest poses all the time because he was, you know, had the most insane conditioning, and just year round he was just like redlining his body. And then he had like one of the worst deaths, unfortunately, one of the most gruesome outcomes of all. And like, if you actually go look at the details, it's like pretty brutal about what actually caused it at the end of it. It wasn't just heart failure. So yeah, definitely something to be noted here. Granted, I don't know if you should really accept guest posing, you know, jobs if you look bad, but I mean, at the same time, you shouldn't expect a bodybuilder to look insane year round, because it's just unrealistic. Even like, you know, most physique guys, expecting them to look shredded year round, it's unrealistic and it's not sustainable.
You know, if anything, I'm a happy piece of shit then.
Well, we mentioned steroids, and we mentioned the growth. How about insulin? Is that insulin a drug that you believe in using?
No. I just think there's certain places. Sometimes you gotta draw the line. You have to draw the line. I'm not a diabetic. There's no reason for me to be using insulin.
So obviously that's not necessarily true. Not that he's not a diabetic, the fact that he has no reason to be using insulin. Like, obviously, especially if you're using growth hormone, you're constantly spiking your glucose levels. It could actually potentially be relieving stress on your pancreas by using insulin in conjunction with the exogenous growth hormone. But who knows what his, you know, fasting blood sugar is like, what his insulin levels are like. You know, I can't see this guy's blood work, so I have no idea if he actually needed it or not. But a lot of bodybuilders who use high dosages of GH, they would probably benefit from some insulin, not even in the context of trying to gain muscle, just to like prevent beta cells from burning out and your pancreas from functioning without as much of a workload on it. So obviously that's something to speak with your physician about and not listen to random people on the internet, but I'm just saying.
I think food lets you gain weight. So therefore, I mean, you just gotta eat. You know, I think sometimes it's gone a little too far. You know, where it seems like everyone is looking for a shortcut, and there shouldn't be any shortcut, because only the best of the best should be here. And it shouldn't be because of drugs or anything else. It should be because of hard work, dedication, sacrifice, you know, trying to have something live on. That guys before myself has worked long and hard and made no money, you know, to get, you know, someone like myself to this point where we actually can make a living from it and don't have to work. I think it's sad that it's at a point now where people dying. I think, yeah, a lot of guys from the past, you know, the sport that they built, they see it being in jeopardy, you know? I mean, because of some young hothead who just don't want to go in the gym and do the work, or just don't want to diet long enough,
Right.
you know, so.
You mentioned something earlier, not to take you off this point, because it's a very interesting point, and I appreciate your sincerity and your truthfulness about how you feel about it. But you mentioned GH, you use up to 9 IUs a day.
Right.
Does that go on for months at a time, or?
I don't think anyone can afford to do it months at a time.
Okay, so he did say 9 IUs earlier at that part. I couldn't figure out what he said. 9 IUs of GH.
You know, but
That duration might be?
I'd say about 10 weeks, you know.
Up to the show?
Yeah.
You don't get off prior to the show?
You get off about 2 weeks out from the show, or a week, because it does make you retain some fluid.
So you would stop steroids and growth?
I would personally, and I would suggest also, any kind of low base, stop about 3 weeks out. Stick more with the water base, which would be like Winstrol Depot or testosterone suspension.
One thing I should note that I forgot to touch on earlier is it seems like these guys grow into shows, like they take a long time off. Assuming he's telling the truth, it's that he's off for like 7 months, and then he basically gains all his size in like a few months and like gets shredded going into the show simultaneously. So in that case, GH dosages meant for growth in terms of, aiding anabolic assistance and gaining muscle, I guess it's more applicable in the context of somebody growing into a show to be using dosages like pushing your IGF like 9 IUs of, if this was pharma grade GH, which I'm assuming it was, like you're looking at like a super IGH level, like close to 1,000 maybe. I don't even know, to be honest. Like I've seen in my own blood work personally at 3 IUs of high quality pharma grade, it was like 489 or something, and that was only 3 IU, so I can just imagine what 9 is. And that's like acromegaly levels already, so you can just imagine what that would do with long-term use, and probably inevitably justify the use of insulin if it was long-term. But I guess 10 weeks, I don't know, that seems still pretty dumb to me to not use insulin alongside 9 IUs of GH. But anyways, and then he drops the GH 3 weeks out and switches to water-based gear. Like wouldn't even constitute like switching out GH for water-based gear is like the same. It's like apples to oranges. But obviously you can see the mindset of these guys. It's to like get rid of stuff that holds water and to introduce things that are in and out of your system quick, with the theory that it's like drier, and using DHT derivatives like Winnie, water-based Winnie, and like faster acting tests and whatnot to not hold sub-Q water, I suppose. But anyways, let's continue.
Which again, anything that's water-based can also be a lot safer because it stays in your system a lot shorter. The lifespan is about 36 hours for the suspension. So it's only in your system for 36 hours and it's out, in comparison to something that's going to stay there for months. So it has that much,
much longer.
Yeah, much longer time to do damage. Anything that's water-based doesn't retain any fluid whatsoever, and will still keep us in the muscle. Yeah.
Okay. The next topic I'm thinking about is diuretics. Is that a part of your program as well?
No, because right now they do testing, in the IFBB, so that's the thing. They eliminated. I think most of the times when athletes get in trouble, it's not from steroids, because from in the past, you've never heard anything happening to any of the guys from back in the 70s, early 80s. It's more in the 90s. With the new crop bodybuilders. And I think what it is they just took the diuretic thing a little too far, and by the fact that the IFBB has implicated now the drug testing at the shows, I think it's cut down a lot of any kind of fatality happening there, anything like, So, no, there's no diuretic in the plan, and even for any amateur, I would suggest leaving it alone, because it does more harm than good.
So you've never...
It's interesting because most of the other guys are talking about using the diuretics. I can't even think of a bodybuilder off the top of my head that did get busted for diuretics in the 90s. Maybe, I think Nasser did. Nasser, I don't know, I guess that's how you pronounce it. And that's all I can think of off the top of my head. I'm not even 100% sure if that's a fact or not, but I don't know how heavily this rule was implemented to begin with, but it didn't seem like it was that effective at straying guys from using it, except with Paul here, assuming it's Paul, I don't really know. Apparently he didn't use any, which is interesting.
You used diuretics prior to a show?
Oh, I have. Yeah, I definitely have in the past, you know.
Any problems with diuretics?
None whatsoever, none, you know, that I can, you know, go into, but again, it's hard to, when there's no one supervising, no one medically monitoring, telling you, you know, what's a good dosage. I mean, you know, you're assuming. You're cutting your fluid, you're cutting your sodium, so you don't know when you're dehydrated. I mean, everyone is dehydrated, but to what level? You know, you can be dehydrated and still be fine, but to what level do you dehydrate where it becomes severe? You know, so when I've used any kind of diuretic, it would be aldactone, which really is it's not really a diuretic. It's all it does is cuts off your aldosterone level, which is stops you from when you get nervous, let the water come to the surface of the skin, or the night before you take a diazide, which again, it's still a diuretic, but it's still a more milder form in comparison to Lasix, you know, or anything injectable or anything like that.
See, it's funny because this is all like the exact same stuff that is, you know, parroted around today. Not necessarily saying it doesn't work. Like, obviously it does. Diazide like the day before, having like a half diazide the night before, and like aldactone the week leading up, and blah, blah, blah. And it's Lasix is too sketchy and blah, 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 which it is probably, to be honest. But, you know, aldactone is, I think, a terrible drug, to be honest. That's just my opinion. It's an anti-androgen used for males who want to transition to female, and it just is super hard to fill out on it. Like, I've used it a couple times and I'm just not a fan. It makes, like, strings out the physique brutally, and it's kind of interesting how it's like the exact same, it sounds like it's the exact same protocol as being used in the 90s as like a lot of gurus are giving out now, which is like the aldactone in peak week up until like the day before, and the diazide and blah blah blah.
Have you ever had a circumstance or a problematic situation?
And by the way, most gurus, they don't even know how to, like, okay, I can't speak for all of them, but most of them don't know how to interpret hydration and kidney stress. So trusting a guy, some random guy who like preps, you know, bikini competitors, or preps like, you know, random, just I don't know if he doesn't have like the, it's hard to say, does this guy have credentials and know what he's talking about? Because like some of the guys who know the most stuff are just like random dudes who aren't, you know, MDs or anything. But at the same time, it's like, I feel like you have to know this stuff like inside out yourself, especially when it comes to diuretics. Because if you're just trusting some random guy to tell you how to literally regulate how your body's functioning with and pissing out and excreting electrolytes, and your electrolyte balance itself, which is going to dictate if your heart just like ceases to work or not. Like, this is stuff that you don't just leave up to chance and hope that the guy knows what he's talking about based on his track record. Like, literally go research how all of these diuretics use yourself, the mechanisms of action. Like, this is not something to mess around with and just like, you know, trust some random protocol that was designed for you from some guy that you paid $1,000. So be super careful about diuretics. I have friends, personal friends, that have almost died from diuretic use, who were healthy individuals that, you know, used a bunch of stuff and then they were, you know, seemingly healthy, and then just like the diuretics can literally take you from being healthy and kill you like instantly. Just not instantly, but like in the process of trying to dry out for a show, you can just totally destroy yourself. So be extremely careful with diuretics, and ideally just avoid them entirely is what I would advise.
Which really scared you?
Well, I've had moments, you know, that think, you know, where you makes you think twice about what you're doing, you know.
For instance, without indicting yourself.
Yeah, it'd be hard for me to do it without, you know.
Implicating yourself.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there are times when, you know, they went in a hotel room and, you know, you can feel like, you know, like a tingle all over your body. You feel like little hands crawling over you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you look in the mirror and you look incredible, you know.
One thing that I'm wondering about this whole thing is, obviously most of the bodybuilders stayed anonymous with the exception of Lee Priest. He just like blatantly went out and said whatever he wanted. I'm wondering if this actual series had something to do with his getting screwed at the Olympia in placements. Like, I don't know, because obviously it's not from like objectively from the IFBB back then. I would assume they would not want their bodybuilders talking about use openly and like showing their faces. So there are probably a lot of perhaps compounding factors, but I'm wondering if that was one of the main ones that led to, like, I think he probably got screwed on some of his placements like a handful of times at least. So I'm wondering if this literal series had something to do with it. Something just popped up in my head right now.
I mean, you look like something out of a desert, you know. But that's when that's at the point where, you know, I think I'm in trouble too, because it's too much. It's you know, it's too dry. It's the point where how much water is really in your body, you know. And then if you start having a problem in your hotel room with cramping, what's going to happen when you go on stage? Where, you know, the light can be 120 degrees, and you're being called out, after call-outs. You know, you start secreting more fluid, which you don't already have. So, I mean, there's a potential right there, you know? Yeah.
Based on some of the drugs we talked about, GH and steroid and the like, on an estimation, your estimate, what would you estimate would be an annual expense to get ready for the Olympia each year?
15,000.
15,000?
Yeah.
I've heard guys mention numbers of, you know, like 100,000.
Oh God,
Are
no.
they exaggerating?
That's crazy. I mean, why the hell would you spend 100 grand
Yeah.
to make 100 grand? You know? I mean,
15,000, that still seems like a lot though. Like back then, think about $15,000 over 20 years ago now, for, like, I'm assuming most of that is GH based on his dosage and that expense, because gear is definitely not that expensive.
no. I mean, I've heard guys spend 20,000 and 25,000, you know? I mean, I think you're crazy to spend, you know? I mean, I think I'm crazy to spend 15,000, you know? I mean, because you're not guaranteed anything, you know? So here you are trying to make a buck when you're actually spending, you know, you got to weigh it out and ask yourself, is it worth it, you know? I mean, would I be better off keeping my 15,000 in my pocket, you know? And just be a freak and guest pose and don't ever compete? Or, you know, I mean, I see a time where I ask myself, you know, how do these guys survive? How did you do so many shows in a year? Where, you know, even if they're only spending 5,000, but if you're spending 5,000, you're doing 4 shows a year, you know? I just can't see how it can be healthy, you know, to do 4, 5, 6 shows in 1 year. You know, I mean, you're taking a punishment, taking a pounding, you know, but 100 grand.
I mean, how do you account for the fact that you just mentioned, I mean, that, you know, you're naturally a big man, close to 300 pounds. And in my day when I was competing, you were over 200, you were big. You think it's just, you know, genetics nowadays, and with the drugs, or?
It's what's in the water. It's like, look at basketball players and, you know, football players. Just the other day I was watching a football game and they were saying how, you know, they showed you 10 years ago what the average team, what their linemen weighed. And in 5 years, and to now, they've gained 50 pounds.
You think it's mostly genetics?
I think a lot of it is better nutrition, better equipment, you know. I don't know, it just seems like every generation, you know, things change. You know, how do you account for all these basketball players being so tall, you know? I mean,
I think it would be kind of naive to not mention the growth hormone and insulin use in the 90s relative to the 70s and 80s, as well as probably more accessible to other hormones that necessarily weren't used in the 70s and 80s. Not necessarily more efficacious or anything, but, you know, there's obviously more variety and things that didn't seem to be commonplace in the 70s that, you know, a lot of guys are getting now. You know, anadrol, things like, I've only heard of, like, in the 70s, it seemed like it was like D-ball, Primo, stuff like that. But now you have guys using testosterone, you have guys using GH, you have guys using insulin, you have guys using anadrol, etc. Haven't heard any trenbolone yet, though, which is interesting.
we look at old footage and the guys that were tall, but now, you know, for a guy to be 6'9" in the NBA, he's a guard. Back in the day, you know, a guard was like 6'1", 6'2", 6'3". When a guard was 6'4", they were like, ooh, he's pretty, you know?
Yeah, you're right.
And now it's the guy's 6'9". Yeah, he's short. Like, you know, yeah. So it just seemed like, I mean, nothing ever stays the same, and you know, every generation, it just seems like it just keeps evolving, you know.
I think some people, you know, that view our sport, especially the guys, you know, that are up and coming, think it's genetic. It's not necessarily genetics exclusively. It's more like the better drugs, designer drugs, chemical warfare, and but from your point of view, you feel it's more genetic.
I think it's genetic and genetic response to the drugs, and a higher population amount, leaving more genetic outliers in sheer number. That's what I think, anyways. So there's like more genetic anomalies because of the higher population who respond insanely well to drugs with just insane, you know, structures and muscle bellies and genetic response in general. That's my take. I'm assuming he's probably going to say something similar, but we'll see.
I think genetics is everything. I mean, it's either you have it or you don't. You know, you've seen guys where you go in the gym and you've taken off 2-3 months from training. You drop 30, 40 pounds. And you come back and you pass them. And there they are in the same position. They haven't moved one bit. You know, some people have it, some people don't. I think the guys who are good, with or without any drug, they're going to be good. You know, number one, they just have, they have, their heart is in it. You know, if you're half-assed and coming in thinking that, you know, well, I'm going to take drugs and I'm going to be like one of the top guys. No, you're going to be one of the scrubs, you know? I mean, that's all there is to it. I just think some people, you look at some bodybuilders and you just don't have the heart to tell them, buddy, you don't have it. Well, bodybuilders, I don't know what kind, they need glasses, most bodybuilders.
The judges.
I know. Because
that laugh sounds insane with the voiceover change.
They only test for diuretics, from what I understand right now. Are there masking agents that, well, you don't usually take diuretics?
Actually, you know what? I don't know if there's anything to mask it, to be honest, because, I mean, I've heard some people say drink vinegar, you know?
Yeah,
I mean,
we used to do that.
I heard people say drink vinegar, you know? But you're so scared that you don't want to. I mean, if you remember, you know, there was the 1996 Mr. Olympia, you know, where certain athletes fail, you know, and place second, you know, and have to lose that place, you know, to be second, you know, in the Mr. Olympia, I mean, to me, is just as good as winning it, because it could have been a 1-point difference. You know, it doesn't mean that because those 11 people picked that one guy's Mr. Olympia doesn't mean that it couldn't have gone the other way, you know. So when you look at it, you know, it makes you think, do I want to be that, you know? So isn't it, it's better just to diet a little harder, do a little more cardio, and come in shape. I really don't think you need diuretics, to be honest. I think if you're in shape, you know, you're in shape. Because I've seen guys do it. I mean, you see guys in the gym all the time.
obviously I'm not like a top level guy who actually knows, but I mean, from what I've seen in, you know, my experience, it seems like it comes more down to, do you still have fat to lose or are you in shape? Because a lot of times the diuretic use is to make up for fat loss that hasn't been accomplished yet. Because if you're 5% body fat, like, you're dry, regardless of if you take a diuretic or not. So, you know, I think most of it just comes down to getting lean enough, like he's saying.
Where you look at him, there, just the average guy, but he's so shredded. He looks so dry, you know. This is just an average guy working out, working hard. He works he has a 9-to-5 job. He may have a wife and kid at home, but he just comes in the gym and he trains his ass off. And you know, if he can do it, you know, why can't guys who don't have a job and their job is just to train, you know, why can't they do that? You know, so I mean, even if there was a mask, even if there was something to mask it, I think most pros are too afraid. Too afraid to try it. You know,
even though they were used before a lot.
Yeah, and I've heard them say it. You know, that they're afraid. You know, they don't want to go that route. They don't want to be the one. You know, 'cause that's a big scandal. You know, at the same time, they don't want to embarrass their friends, their family, and themselves. So it's, you know, the best thing is to leave it the way it is with the testing and figure out the diuretics.
Continuing along the line of other agents, is there anything you found effective, like escalene, injecting it directly into the muscle, any of those kind of products?
I've tried it. I've tried escalene. But
there's some new one I think I've heard mentioned.
Oh yeah, now everyone is big on pump and pose or whatever you want to call it. You know, see, you know, again, to me that's just too far, you know. Because that's not real, you know. Bodybuilding is about, it's you, it's about you, it's about your body. It's to show how, you know, how far you can take your body, just what you can do with your body.
So what's funny about that is that's like the reference to this new thing, the pump and pose. That's like original synthol, when synthol first came out in the 90s, and it's like seen as this like next generation, like new revolutionary thing. And acetylcholine, which is like essentially obsolete now, I guess is like the popular thing back in the 90s. And tables have kind of turned, it seems like. I don't know if acetylcholine is still used in modern times, but I'm assuming it's a lot harder to get than it used to be, because I haven't really heard of anyone using it.
You know, like guys putting calf implants, you know. How can this be bodybuilding? You know, this is more like, you know, body making. It's like someone making a body, like you're some kind of a sideshow, you know.
I know.
I mean, I'd rather have, you know, 19-inch arms than pump something in it to put to 21. Because, you know, how am I going to feel? I didn't work for this. This is not mine, you know. And some guys feel good about it and look in the mirror and say, wow. And it's still not the same. It's not the quality. It doesn't have the quality, you know. You can look at the arms and see that, you know, it's been enhanced. Like something else is in there, you know, the calf. Most guys, there are a lot of guys putting in their shoulders. You know, I've heard of guys putting in their back. You know, I mean, I'm like, either you have it or you don't. Now, when you have to go to that extent, then it's just too far. You know, that's where you have to draw the line and ask yourself, you know, are you willing to go that distance? You know, me personally, I'm not. You know, I mean, it's actually injecting fat into the muscle, which also can be, I mean, extremely dangerous. You know, I mean, here we are, we're supposed to be so healthy, and you're injecting fat in your body. So what's that going to do? Give you high cholesterol? You can make clogs up your artery? That's a heart attack right there. You know, I mean, there's so many things that they, you know, they could give themselves a blood clot right there if they inject it wrong. You know, so.
How about things like we read about in the magazines, like roid rage, and does that really
I've never believed in it.
Okay.
I'm a pretty mellow person, and you know, I chose to do this. You know, it wasn't a means to an end. It was what I wanted to do. You know, so
I pretty much agree with that too. It's like if you're like have a terrible personality and you like lash out at people naturally, gear will just exacerbate that and make it worse. But if you're like super chill normally, I highly doubt gear will make you, you know, insane. So at least in my experience, it hasn't been the case. It might get like a bit more edgy at most. And that was like even when I did what I would consider high dosages. And it was barely like a difference then. So I think it's more like your personality type to begin with. And then the hormones just kind of like exaggerate it to some extent.
when I diet, you know, I can't get mad at anyone because at any moment I can quit. I can just say, okay, that's it. I don't want to do it anymore. And I can walk away. So therefore, when I go in the gym, why am I going to have an attitude to people? You know, I grant you, you know.
I remember.
Yeah, you know. So basically what I do when I go in the gym, I hold my head down, I put my hat on, I put my game face on, you know. And it's up to all the individuals around me to give me that respect, to realize that, you know, I'm a professional, I'm here to do a job. I can't come to your workplace and harass you. So when I'm at my job, don't harass me. And if you come up to me, I will tell you to leave me alone, but I don't have to be rude, I can be polite about it, you know. Or I've heard about guys who, you know, going off on their girlfriends, going off on their wives, and, you know, I mean, that's your team. You know, because in bodybuilding, it's not a team. It's not like a football game team, you know, where you have, you know, 40-something guys in the roster. The only person that's on your team is either your girlfriend or your training partner. You know, your training partner is like your wife. You know, he's better be there every day. You know, he's got to call you, he's got to wake you up. You know, he's got to keep you from shitting. You know, so how can I go nuts on these people? You know, they're the people that's in my corner. I just think Lloyd Rage is just someone who's an asshole from day one. And just have an excuse, you know, because, you know, everyone says, oh, yeah, this will do this to you and this will do that to you. I just think it's all you. It ain't about anything else. I have so many friends who we're all on the same level, and we still hang out every day and diet. Still play our games and still go out to eat and go see a movie together, hang out and just discuss everything that we're doing, you know. Of course, as the show gets closer, anything what happens is you become extremely quiet, you know. And that's because you're tired, you don't want to talk, you don't want to talk. Or if you want to talk to another athlete, you know. I mean, because he's going through the same misery, or he's been there, so he knows what you feel, but you don't want to talk to just the average individual, you know. So I don't believe in roid rage.
On a closing note, and you've given a lot of words of wisdom and advice to our viewers in terms of their approach to the sport. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your comments already in terms of your suggestions, in terms of drug use or non-use? Or
Well, I mean, I would never advocate use of any kind of drugs whatsoever, you know, recreation or whatever. Drugs is drugs, but, you know, no matter what I say, because no matter what anyone said, I was still going to do it no matter what. Only thing I could add is, you know, if you're going to do it, just keep in mind that more is not better. You know, don't just go out there and pick up something and stick it in your body. You know, try to educate yourself. You know, for youngsters, you know, I think it's, you know, give your body a chance to grow on its own. You know, don't think that because you take it, it's going to make you into one of the top bodybuilders. You know, there's no guarantees that that's going to happen. You know, so just be careful, and, you know, the safest thing to do is, you know, get a checkup. You know, at least 2 checkups a year. Get your blood work done so you know what your liver enzyme is, your kidneys, prostate, because too much of this wrong, that's why you can give you prostate cancer. So, you know, I mean, and as long as, if you do this, then at least you minimize the risk getting hurt. I'm not saying you won't get hurt. I'm not saying you will get hurt. I mean, guys do it and walk away healthy, and for them, they can see, just thank God that happens for myself. I pray to God every day that I can do this and walk away and have my health intact.
Well, I'm following you completely. Since one thing that came to my mind just now was blocking agents and things like that. Does that ever play a role in your training? Since we're trying to basically talk about the issues in terms of drugs and estrogen blocking agents.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of there's two blocking agents. There's Diuretics, which a lot of guys use. I'm using myself personally. I prefer Proviron, which is also another blocking agent.
Okay, so to clarify, blocking agent, I suppose it's kind of a general term, but there's two things. Like, obviously he's talking about mitigating estrogen related issues, which that can be accomplished via a selective estrogen receptor modulator, also known as a SERM, or an aromatase inhibitor, also known as an AI. And what he just mentioned is Novadex, which is a SERM, and Proviron, which is pretty much just oral DHT, which is not a SERM whatsoever. What it does, though, is when you increase your androgen index with pure DHT, you antagonize estrogen a bit at the receptor. So Proviron can act as a makeshift anti-estrogen of sorts, but it's not the same mechanism of action, whereby Novadex selectively occupies estrogen receptors and prevents estrogen from binding, and then aromatase inhibitors are what prevents or inhibits aromatization of testosterone, dianabol, etc., and converting into E2, which or I guess in Dianabol's case, different kind of estrogen. But yeah, there's not just two blockers or whatever. There's more than that, and even more than that in just categories, I guess. Like, they're not even mentioning AIs here. So I guess we'll just see what he says.
Dosage related to body weight?
Again, the dosage, for myself, I've gone up to as much as 4 to 5 a day. But that would be maybe 2 weeks out from the show.
I see.
2
weeks.
Like, Proviron is a steroid, if you didn't already know that. It's not intended as a SERM or an AI. Although some people use it as a makeshift one, sort of.
Out from?
Yeah.
And after the show.
And it also helps free up a lot of testosterone that's bound to SHBG and has, a favorable mechanism of action in terms of sort of like maximizing the available usable tests in your body and antagonizing some circulating estrogen.
Before
the show. Okay.
So you're trying to lower your estrogen level as much as possible. I mean, as time going on, I actually didn't use any estrogen blocker at all.
Is there anything used to enhance natural secretion of the pituitary in terms of testosterone after the event? Like HCG, Clomid?
Yeah, I've used HCG, Clomid, probably for about a month straight, trying to bring your own natural testosterone level back down.
And again, dosage to body weight, but your dosage?
The thing is, everything should always go by body weight. Always keep in mind that, more is not better. Also, another subject that, we should touch on is thyroids.
Okay, good point.
Again, thyroid is not something to be joked with, because that can leave you totally messed up and all said and done.
Do you find that is a part of your program?
Definitely, Personally, I like cider mill.
Cider mill?
Yeah, 7 weeks out from the show, I'll go up to as much as 100 microgram.
Jesus.
Which, again,
per day.
Yeah, which you don't want to, again, you do that about 7 weeks out. And
that's the highest dosage T3 I've heard of a high-level guy using. Like, most guys avoid T3 because it's not muscle-sparing whatsoever. It's going to tear through stored fat as well as stored muscle. Even if you're on a ton of anabolics, it's still going to tap into stored muscle protein. And 100 is quite a bit, 100 micrograms. Like, obviously, again, take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. I'm just saying anecdotally from what I've seen, anything over 50 seems to be overkill in terms of T3.
You pair it up, and you pyramid back down.
I see.
So you want to start off with one a day for at least 2 weeks, up to 2 a day, stay there for a while, up to 3, then the last 3 weeks, then you would go up to 4, trying to get rid of any little help to enhance getting rid of any fat.
Mm-hmm. Do you do a pyramid approach or regressive system with steroids as well?
Yeah. Nothing should be stopped cold turkey.
Okay.
You know.
So when you stop the steroids, as you mentioned prior to the event,
you pyramid down.
You pyramid down.
Yeah. So you pyramid up, you pyramid down.
I see.
I mean, a good example would be, if what happens if you slam on the car brakes? Just if you're going 90 miles an hour and you jam on your car brakes, you know, you may fly through the window. That's a possibility. It may stop you, it may be okay. So it's the same thing with the steroids. You could, you know, you're doing it would be like going 90 miles an hour where you're taking this and you're taking that and you're taking this high dosage, and out of the blue you just stop.
Now, obviously, a lot of you guys aren't going to agree with what he's saying here, and logically it would make sense why, but you have to keep in mind that in the 90s, there's no, like, you know, rhyme or reason to a lot of this stuff. It was just based on what other guys are doing and what seems to be the correct way to go about things, but, like, I probably would have logically thought what he's saying right there, too, in the 90s, but, like, you know, suppressing your hormone production past the point of when your cycle should be occurring just for the sake of titrating down, it doesn't necessarily make sense, in my opinion. You know, like, you're just prolonging your recovery period to just for the sake of tapering down, when it's like you're suppressed regardless if you're on 50 mgs a test or 500 mgs a test. So I would just personally, I just try and get into PCT as quick as possible to recover homeostasis and natural function. But that would be, obviously, everything's an individual preference. There's no, like, right and wrong way to go about these things. Well, there's obviously a wrong way to go about things, but I mean, like, there's not, like, a set in stone correct way to do stuff.
Of that, you know? So it's better to gradually let your body adapt to that. Let your body adjust to what you're doing.
Is there a certain weekly, you may have already mentioned this already, is there a certain weekly milligram total of steroid you would look at in terms of being a high dosage for you? As you pyramid up and pyramid down.
A high dosage would be, 600 milligrams of testosterone, 600 milligrams of DECA, 2 anadrols, 9 IUs of GAA.
The highest level.
That's my highest
I see.
level.
And prior to that, you would work up to that and work down.
I'd work up to that and then work myself back down.
So it's almost like, sort of like tackling the myostatin issue, like, right there, because he titrates up, which I didn't really realize earlier when he was talking about it. I don't know if he made it clear or not, but so he starts low, and then as myostatin elevates to inhibit, you know, prevent further muscle growth, the dosage gets titrated up more, and so on and so forth throughout the entirety of the cycle, it sounds like, which makes more sense for his goals. Total androgen load of taking only, what is that, 1,200 per week. If you have 600 tests per week, 600 DECA, and then he was like 50 to 100 anadrol, which is on the high end, 700 a week of anadrol. So that's 1,900. So that's like 2 grams of gear total, which is like a lot less than a lot of people think these guys are using. So if he's telling the truth, that's it's pretty interesting to say the least. And 9 IUs of Pharma GH, though, that's, you know, quite a bit in contrast to what I was expecting to hear him say, to be honest.
Again, like I said, for my personal thing, I'd rather do, 4 different things together. Because sometimes certain things interact better. One thing makes the other thing work. It's like growth hormone and testosterone. Testosterone with anadrol. Everything helps the next one that bit more. So instead of cramming a ton of it all at once, again, let your body utilize it, gradually. Let it work more efficiently. It'll, long run, you'll find that it'll be a lot safer. You'll get more out of it. Because when you put too much in your body, it's like trying to study for a test, and you try to cram it all in one night. You can't do it. you forget all about it. So you're like, oh, you get frustrated. It's the same thing with your body. You try to cram too many things in, you shut your body down.
It's a good analogy.
But if you study a little today, a little tomorrow, a little the next day, gradually it will all come to you. Same thing with that. If you put a little in today, a little in tomorrow, gradually, step by step, you'll get what you're looking for without totally just messing yourself up.
In regards to amount of calories you eat a day, in protein, carbohydrate, fat ratios, I mean, is there a system you follow?
Yeah, I always tell people, but believe it or not, there is some method to all this madness. And sometimes it doesn't. I say madness because sometimes you think about it, it doesn't sound logic, I mean, in the off season, which would be when you're not concentrating on a show or anything, I don't usually think about what I'm eating. I don't think about the calories or protein or anything like that. But in preparation for a show, then yes, I do concentrate on the amount of protein and fats, carbohydrates I take in.
What's it like before, when you're thinking about a show? What would be the caloric intake per day?
About getting ready for a show, about 4,000. About 4,000 calories a day.
And then as far as protein?
Which would consist of chicken, steak, turkey. Again, mixing my protein. So I'm getting protein from different
sources.
Source of food groups. Carbohydrate.
How many grams of protein a day?
Anywhere from 450 to 600.
Wow.
Jeez. So 4,000 calories a day at the start of a prep, and 450 to 600 grams of protein. So that's actually kind of what I expected, to be honest. A lot of guys think that the pros eat a ton, but I think the reality is that they just grow off of normal amounts that everyone thinks are, they must be using freakish double what they're using to be bigger than them. But the reality is they probably do the same thing as you. They just respond 100 times better. So if you can get shredded eating like 2,500 calories, 2,400 calories, whatever, it's like a pretty common number to get down to when you're prepping for a show. Titrating back up, do you really need to jump to 5,000 calories to grow? Like maybe like in a few months, once you plateaued like 50 times on your way there. But when you start and you're just trying to grow, I think 4,000 seems pretty reasonable. Granted, this guy's like 300 pounds. I don't know if he has to increase it eventually or what, but I think it's grossly exaggerated what a lot of people think these pros are eating, to be honest, to grow. Like, I think most of them are probably having like 4,000 to 5,000 calories to grow.
Yeah. You keep the carbohydrate low, though.
Okay.
Carbohydrate would be about anywhere from 100 to maybe 200 a day.
It's prior to an event.
Yeah.
Off season.
You don't even care, So the carbohydrate would be very low.
How about the fat intake?
And you keep your fat intake. You do need fats. You need all food groups. You need fats, you need the carbs, you need the protein for them to work in conjunction together.
Any idea of how many grams?
So probably, I'd say about 75 grams of fats to 100 grams of fats.
It's a very high protein, low carbohydrate sort of diet you follow.
Yeah, high protein, low carbs, a moderate amount of fats.
So he's claiming he doesn't even monitor his diet in the off season, which is 7 months of the year. Then for 5 months, he's on point and he's having 100 to 150 grams of carbs or whatever he said, and then 450 to 600 protein, which is interesting because most guys who have a ton of muscle are slamming a lot more carbs. So I don't know, he's like growing like all this muscle and just like 100 to 150 carbs. It seems pretty low and kind of insane to me, to be honest, because usually the theory is, carbs are muscle sparing. So, increase your carb intake when you're trying to gain muscle, and lower your protein intake so you can handle more carbs, kind of thing. Because obviously you don't need as much protein when your carbs are super high. So it's interesting to hear his protein cranked up to 600 and then having a low carb. I thought it would have been a more middle ground, but apparently not.
What your body does need, for the lubricant, for the joints, the internal organs and all these things,
Another point I wanted to address with you. would be, so many times in the magazines we see a lot of top bodybuilders endorsing, I don't want to mention names, but endorsing this product, and this product is the magic substance or the solution to, you know, steroids and in other words, the real drugs. In other words, nutraceuticals comes into play. I mean, are there nutrient type situations or compounds or nutraceuticals that really do work? What do you think about that?
There's a lot of products, I mean, that do work. I think in a couple of years back, maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, nutrition wasn't as good as it is right now. But I mean, I'm a firm believer in protein drinks. You know, I mean, you have a lot of athletes who don't have big appetites, and the way they get their calories in or their protein is by, you know, the protein supplements. You know, whether it's in a package or, you know, in a container, whichever way they do it. But, and of course, you do need vitamins, minerals, all these different things, antioxidants to flush out the body. I mean, B vitamin is one of the best vitamins, you know, you can get. Then combined with your vitamin C. So there's a lot of products out there. There's some products that I really don't know too much about, you know, because I never stopped to take the time to educate myself on it, because I don't think it's something that is 100% must for me. But I do believe that multi-mineral, vitamins, B complex, you know, my proteins. Yeah, I do believe 100% in all the basics, you know, chromium, all the things that were there 20 years ago, that are still here right now. Only it's just been enhanced this much better because the technology is so much better. I totally believe in those 100%.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Interesting. So, not, you know, dosages weren't crazy high. GH was moderately high, but the anabolics themselves didn't pass 2 grams at the highest, apparently. And no insulin use, no diuretic use, really. And a lot more moderated than you would expect from a guy who's easily considered one of the biggest mass monsters of the 90s. So, a lot of good takeaways from that video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it, found it insightful and interesting. Please like, subscribe, hit that notification bell if you want to get updated when I post new videos. Check out my blog, moreplatesmoredates.com. I'll have written transcript of this video itself over there too. Instagram at moreplates_moredates, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, etc. Check out the links in the video description below for where you can support my content in terms of products I endorse and back and believe in personally. Thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.